Welcome everyone. I'm Jennifer Dill, Professor of Urban Studies and Planning here at Portland State University and Director of TREC, our Transportation Research and Education Center. And I am here today talking about some of the research that I've been doing over the past few years, specifically focusing on the gender gap in bicycling. And today I'm going to focus on girls and differences between girls and boys in looking at that gender gap. So without further ado, I'm going to launch in. So in case you have not noticed when you're out there on the streets of Portland or any other U.S. city, women and girls do not bicycle nearly as much as men and boys. So these data are national data from the U.S., and you see on the left here that about 40% of boys but only 31% of girls rode their bike in the past week. 10% of men compared to 5% of women rode their bike in the past week. The two figures on the right are the same thing but for walking. And we don't see a gender gap at all with respect to walking for either kids or adults. And so one question is, well, why is that in the U.S.? Because when we go to other countries, these data are for adults, but when you go to other countries, you definitely, where you have good infrastructure and support for bicycling, you do not see that gap. So the three countries on the right, they're Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. About half or more of the bicycle trips are made by women. Whereas in the U.S., the U.K., and Canada, a quarter to less than a third of the bike trips are made by women. So that leads to the question of, what leads to this gender gap? And in particular, today I'm going to focus on kids and what we might be seeing in terms of differences between boys and girls. I'm going to be using some data from the Family Activity Study. So this was a longitudinal study that I conducted here in Portland. It was funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's Active Living Research Program and also OTREC. I want to acknowledge a couple members of the team, Nathan McNeil and Joe Broach, who worked on the project for the entire time. Numerous other grad students helped on this project as well. What this was, it was a long-term longitudinal study where we recruited about 300 families in the city of Portland along these corridors that you can see shaded in green and blue. The overall purpose of the study was to evaluate changes in behavior and activity over time, specifically with respect to the construction of new infrastructure, and in this case, bicycle boulevards or neighborhood greenways that were being constructed in the city of Portland. So what we did is, you'll see there's both green corridors and blue corridors. The blue corridors are what we call the treatment corridors. Those are corridors where a bicycle boulevard was going to be constructed during our study period, and the green are what we call the treatment or the controls, where there would not be a bike boulevard constructed. So in a sense, it was a natural experiment. Now, today I'm not going to be focusing on sort of the effects of bike boulevards on travel. We are still digging through those data. I have a little bit on that, but I'm going to be focusing on more overall what we're seeing between kids living in all of these areas. So, what did data collection entail? We did surveys of both the kids and the adults in these families. We collected GPS data and accelerometer data. So everyone who participated, and that was at least one kid and one adult from each family, wore a GPS unit and an accelerometer for 5 days every time they left their home. And so the accelerometer measures their physical activity and their level of physical activity. The GPS obviously records where they are. And it's the GPS data in particular that can tell us, helps tell us what type of travel they're doing and where they're doing that travel. So again, 5 days plus surveys that told us about things like attitudes and all sorts of other things you'll see a bit of. So when did we collect the data? So first of all, this is a longitudinal study. We started out with what I'm referring to as pre-data collection. And that occurred in either July through October 2010 or April through August 2010, depending on the recruitment period. So generally good weather period. And so again, GPS and accelerometer for 5 days, and then everyone completed a survey. And then 2 years later, we did the same thing with the same people and the same families, and that again occurred either between August and October of 2012 or April to August 2013. You can come to the front. Feel free to walk in front. Everyone always sits in the back and on the edges. Okay, so again, the basic thing to remember here is that there was 2 years in between our pre-data and our post-data collection. So we started out, just so you have an idea, we started out with 328 households. Those households included 491 adults, 322 kids that when they started were between the ages of 5 and 10, and 175 kids when they started were between, actually, 11 and 17. As you can imagine, 2 years later, not everyone sticks around, no matter how hard we try. Either they don't want to do it, or they move, or all sorts of things happen. In our post-data collection period, we had 262 households or families that continued in the study, including 260 of the younger kids and 134 of the older kids. Those two age groups, 5 to 10 and 11 to 17, just so you know, the surveys were different for those two groups of kids, as you can imagine, those of you who have kids or you can remember. Definitely a 5 or 6-year-old is not able to answer the same types of questions that a 15-year-old can answer. So the 5-year-old, the 5 to 10 survey was far fewer questions, more simplistic, and the older kids got a more involved questionnaire. And the surveys, even if they started out, let's say, at 10 years old, 2 years later they were still answering the same survey form. So it's the same questions 2 years later. So just so you have an idea of the distribution of the sample, you can see here sort of the number of kids and their ages as they started out in the study. Couple notes you'll see, we did get a handful of 4-year-olds. We did not specifically recruit families with 4-year-olds, but what happened is we would recruit a family that had an older kid, and the younger 4-year-old really wanted to participate. And we thought it was better to have them participate than have someone disappointed. And so we had a handful of 4-year-olds who obviously 2 years later were 6 years old. We did have one 17-year-old, and again, that was another case where some younger kids, and we said, okay, I believe that person dropped out. So it's not affecting results. But you can see for the most part, as you saw before, we have a lot of 5 to 10-year-olds. The other thing I'll just clue you in terms of a lot of the graphs that I'll be showing, I'm pretty sure I'm very consistent. Boys are in green, girls are in orange, so you can keep those in mind. Okay, so I'm going to launch into some findings. What I'm going to give you first are some caveats. This is hot off the press, so to speak, or hot out the output, or however you want to say it. This is analysis I'm still in the middle of doing. I'm still digesting it myself. It's fairly simple descriptive analysis at this point. And in our discussion part of this, I welcome any ideas that you have. There's a lot more I will be doing with these data. Also keep in mind, you saw where these families live in the city of Portland. On the southeast, northeast, and a few in North Portland. Clearly, families and kids living in those neighborhoods are probably different than a lot of other U.S. cities. And so keep that in mind also when we interpret the results. So what I'm going to talk about, first of all, I'll give you some idea of how much are these kids bicycling. And then I'm going to dig into some of the data that tries to help explain maybe why we see some differences or why there might be differences between boys and girls. So the behavior, so with between the GPS and the accelerometer, we can predict what mode of travel the person is using, okay, with a fairly high degree of accuracy, thanks to some work Joe Broach did. So what this graph is showing is boys and girls and the number of trips they made on bike in those 5 days that we collected data. And what I've done here is I've laid it out. First of all, we have the 5 to 10-year-olds in the pre-data collection period, the 5 to 10-year-olds 2 years later, the 11 to 16-year-olds in pre-data, and the same kids 11 to 16. All of these bars, it's the same kids, so I'm only showing you data from kids that we had both the pre and the post data, so not the families that dropped out, because they might be different. What you can see, I mean, if you just look at the trend, that for both, actually, I should say, for the 5 to 10-year-olds, for both boys and girls, you see a decline over time in terms of biking trips. For the 11 to 16-year-olds over that 2-year time period, we actually saw the boys make more bike trips and the girls make fewer bike trips. But first of all, I want to say, and you can see in a lot of these cases, boys are making more bike trips than girls, though these differences are not statistically significant, okay? But the other thing that you generally see if you look across time and the age groups is that it appears that there's somewhat of a trend between time and age, that girls may be bicycling less and perhaps boys are not changing that much. But again, even this difference here, even though it looks pretty big, it's not statistically significant. And that's partly because, quite frankly, even these kids in Portland are not bicycling that much. So this is a distribution of actual trips. So for the 5 to 10-year-olds, about half of the boys and half the girls did not make a bike trip at all during those 5 days. And then for the 11 to 16-year-olds, about 60% of the boys and over 70% of the girls did not make a bike trip at all in those 5 days. So even in Portland, a lot of our kids are not necessarily biking very often. Because this study was looking at, the overall purpose of the study was to look at potential changes after the construction of bike boulevards, I will show you some of the preliminary numbers on this. So what I have here is at the first top half, 5 to 10-year-olds, boys versus girls, and the control versus the treatment meaning there was a bike boulevard constructed in between the pre and the post period. And we have 2 measures of bicycling activity, the minutes that they were bicycling and then the number of trips they were bicycling. For the most part, and this has changed within an individual over those 2 years, okay? For the most part, didn't see any significant changes. One thing, though, that might be a point of optimism, but it is preliminary, if you look over here for this 11 to 16-year-old girls, what we found in our control is that their bicycling went down between their pre and post periods, but in our treatment areas where the bike boulevards were constructed, we did not see a significant change. So that might be a little bit of optimism that perhaps the bike boulevards are having a positive influence, but we do need to dig into the data a bit more to start controlling for some other factors. Also, what we found when we looked at the adult data, when we looked at sort of treatment versus control, where we did not see significant changes in behavior because of the construction, I suspect that a lot of the seeing no changes has something to do with that I think it takes more time between when something is constructed and when people really change their behavior. And so I don't, if there is behavior change happening, I'm not sure if we were able to detect it because our post period was perhaps too soon after construction. What I want to focus on more is sort of what's going on behind these decisions, what may be influencing girls' behavior with respect to bicycling versus boys. And so first of all, I'm going to look at attitudes. What we definitely see in research on adults is that people's attitudes have a huge influence on their decision to ride a bike. Not as much on decisions to walking. There's something about bicycling that you have to have a real positive attitude about it to really engage in it as a mode of transportation. And so I'm going to show you some of what we're seeing with respect to the girls and boys on attitudes. So first of all, in terms of change, so for the 5 to 10-year-olds, we had statements on this survey like, I like walking, and it was an agree to disagree scale. I like biking. I like riding my bike to school. I like riding my bike to other places. What I'm showing you here, so first of all, it's girls versus boys in the pre-period. We saw no differences. Girls and boys liked biking and walking equally. 2 years later, girls and boys also liked walking and biking equally. Now, the same kids, though, when you look at the same kids 2 years later, what we found, that general statement didn't change at all, but the I like riding my bike to school, both the girls and the boys went down. And then the statement, I like riding my bike to other places, 2 years later, the girls were less likely to agree with that statement compared to what that same girl said earlier, 2 years before. For the 11 to 16-year-olds, the survey was a bit different. There were only 2 of these questions that were the same. And we start to see a similar pattern. We basically start to see girls as they age over time not liking biking as much as boys. So in the post period, girls did not like biking as much as boys, statistically significant. And then the same girls, 11 to 16-year-olds, in that 2-year time period, their attitude towards bicycling became more negative. To sort of show you this graphically, this is the percent of the kids who agreed with that statement, I like biking, either strongly or somewhat. And you can see the 5 to 10-year-olds almost unanimously, they like bicycling, and no difference between boys and girls, didn't change much over time. The 11 to 16-year-olds, a little less, still though, over 80% agreed that they like bicycling. That's a good finding. I think a lot of people would like that approval rating, right? But when we get to 2 years later, the 11 to 16-year-olds, this is where we see that significant difference between boys and girls, and you can see the girls' opinions becoming more negative about bicycling. So not what we want to start seeing. For the 11 to 16-year-olds, we asked a whole series of questions about barriers that keep them from bicycling or bicycling more. We had a long list of factors that we asked them about. I'm showing you all of them. And the answer scale on this was 1 to 5. 1, this isn't a barrier at all for me to bike, or 5 being it's very much a barrier for me to bike. And what I've done is I've ranked these from left to right based on the girls' average scores. So on the left is the biggest barrier the girls indicated, on the right is the smallest barrier. Now, the good thing here, I'm showing you the whole 1 to 5 scale, is for the most part, you know, these numbers were not that high. For the things that we presented to them, these aren't huge barriers. which is a good thing. But there are some where we are seeing differences between the boys and the girls. So for example, weather. At least amongst the 11 to 16-year-olds, when we started out, the girls were more sensitive to rain and cold weather than the boys were. The girls were also more likely to say that I don't have anyone to bike with, and that's a barrier to riding. The girls were also more likely to say that it takes too long and that I don't want to get sweaty. Now again, the difference between the boys and the girls is statistically significant, but the overall score was relatively low, between a 1 and a 2. So we're not talking a big barrier, but we are seeing gender differences. The thing that I found somewhat interesting is it takes too long, because this research that I've done about women and bicycling, that's a barrier for women bicycling as well. They're more likely to say, I don't have time to bike. And that has a lot to do with women's travel patterns being far more often more complicated than men's travel patterns, because they're more likely to be taking kids places, taking other people places, doing the grocery shopping. They take more trips, and they have often more constraints on their travel than men. But we're seeing here, at least among some of these girls, that already in that tween age, they're saying that bicycling takes too long as well. When we look at the same girls, so this graph, the same factors, but we're looking just at the girls, pre versus post. So how did those girls change individually over those 2 years? So there were some changes. So one thing on the positive side, over time, the parents, they were less likely to say that their parents don't want them to bike, which makes sense. As they get older, parents are more accepting of their kids biking. Over time, the girls were more likely to say, it's not fun, I don't feel like it. Fairly broad statement, but again, so that perhaps is explaining some of the differences over time. They were even more likely over time to say, I don't want to get sweaty. And on the end there, they were more likely over time to say, I can't ride my bike well, which I find very interesting, that as they aged, the same individuals were more likely to say that that was a barrier. And that's one I'm trying to sort of figure out what that might mean. Again, not a huge barrier, given the average score, but still. One thing I will point out, the rain and cold over time didn't really change much, and in fact, for the boys over that time period, it went up as a barrier. And so when we look at the same kids 2 years later, rain and cold is an equal barrier for both boys and girls. But then we still see some of the same barriers for girls. The no one to bike with is still a bigger barrier for girls. The I don't want to get sweaty is still a bigger barrier. Now I can't ride my bike well is a bigger barrier. And then another one that popped up 2 years later is my friends don't want me to bike. So a little bit of social. Now again, I want to emphasize these aren't huge barriers. You know, these are scores averaging between 1 and 2, but still starting to see some differences. The it takes too long, though, was not statistically significant in the 2 years later. So we're seeing some. I'll also point out some of the things that there are no differences. There wasn't a difference in terms of wanting to wear a helmet or not. It didn't matter between boys and girls, for example. And my parents don't want me to bike. Again, no differences between the boys and girls. Which brings me to the next point of parent attitudes. Obviously, kids in this age range don't make these decisions on their own. Normally, their parents have to let them bike and obviously get them a bike, etc. And so one thing I wanted to look at is, do parents have different attitudes towards their girls versus their boys and letting them bike and or walk alone or with friends? And generally, there's a lot on here, so generally what I'm going to tell you is that no, we didn't actually see many at all gender differences with the way parents thought about the boys versus the girls. And so what I've included on here is both biking and walking. The general question that we asked the parents is up here on the left. I or we do not feel comfortable allowing this child to walk or bike, separate questions, alone to places in the neighborhood because of, and then we asked about stranger danger versus traffic separately. The only gender differences that we found was for the 5 to 10-year-olds, so the youngest kids, walking alone or biking alone because of stranger danger. But for the most part, the parents did not have different attitudes towards the girls and the boys. And so what I've put on each of these is the boys and the girls and the 2 different ages. One thing of note to point out, sort of a difference biking versus walking, is one thing you see for biking, traffic is a bigger concern for the parents than stranger danger. So you see these bars generally higher for traffic being a barrier than stranger danger for biking. You don't see that for walking, which can make some intuitive sense. And then, so I've talked about the kids' attitudes, talked about the parents' attitudes. So the next thing to think about is the actual infrastructure. Because again, when we look at adults, we often find that women's and men's preferences for infrastructure are different. So I wanted to see if any of that is happening when we look at the kids. So we have a question on the older kids survey where we asked them, how comfortable would you feel riding a bike in this environment? And the options we have, on the right here, sort of the most what we thought might be the most comfortable environment was on a path or trail separate from the street. We then had a street with little traffic and a bike lane. I'm reading from right to left. A street with little traffic and no bike lane. A street with heavy traffic and a bike lane. And then a heavy traffic with no bike lane. And again, these are very broad descriptions. This is a written survey. We're just trying to get people's general sense of comfort level. And this was answered by the kids who do and don't bike. Okay, so all the kids answered these questions. What we see here is for everything except the separate path or trail, boys are saying that they feel more comfortable riding their bike alone in that environment, whether it be a street with traffic, with a lot of traffic, a little traffic, with a bike lane, without a bike lane. The boys always said that they feel more comfortable than the girls. And as the amount of traffic goes down and you add specific infrastructure like a bike lane, for everyone, both the boys and the girls, the comfort level is going up. This is very consistent with, I have a similar question like this that I've asked on surveys of adults in the Portland region. Very similar results. In other words, women usually feel less comfortable in most riding environments except the environments where there's a lot of separation from traffic. Or very little traffic. One thing of particular note, though, we asked the same questions of the kids, and we said, if you were riding with your parents, how comfortable would you feel versus alone? And here we actually see no difference between the genders. So in other words, girls and boys feel equally comfortable riding in these environments when they have their parents along with them. But if you look carefully, there's a couple things going on here. In some cases, the girls are feeling more comfortable with the parents along. There's some other cases where the boys' comfort level is going down a little bit. Okay, so they're sort of meeting. And when I talk to parents of tween and teenage boys, anecdotally, they say that makes a lot of sense in that their boys maybe feel a lot more comfortable, whatever that means to them, without their parents around. Perhaps telling them where they're supposed to bike and stop or whatever it might be. So that interpretation is purely anecdotal. Those of you who have teenage boys or were a teenage boy at one time can interpret why that might be going on. But I think it does say something when we think about sort of policy and what we might be doing. The solutions that we're talking about in cities to get more people generally bicycling, like separated lanes, things like bike boulevards that are reducing the speed and the volume of traffic on streets, those solutions, based on some of these data, would seem to be attractive to getting girls to bike more as well as boys. So, and now I'm going to have a very abrupt ending. So those are sort of my findings, primarily from the survey data. Like I said, this is new analysis of the data. I think when I think so far about what I've presented to you, a few things come out. First of all, some of the difference in attitudes between boys and girls are starting to formulate, and those differences are starting to pop up in those tween years. We see those differences in attitudes amongst women versus men fairly strong in surveys that I've done in Portland and research that people have done in other areas. So it seems to be in those tween years when we start seeing attitudes change. Looking at some of those specific barriers, things like sweaty and time and not having people to bike with were some of the things that pop out as differences between girls and boys. We might start thinking about what are some programs to introduce at a young age to get girls feeling more comfortable in those environments or overcoming some of those barriers. On the more positive side, there were a lot of things where there are no differences between boys and girls, which is a good thing to not be seeing those gender differences. And then on the infrastructure side, as I already said, it appears as if some of the solutions that would address some of these issues for kids are very similar to the solutions that we're already talking about to increase bicycling more broadly. So with that, I will open it up to questions, suggestions. Again, this is sort of some first cut analysis. I am open to hearing your ideas of other questions to answer the surveys that we conducted. There's more data, there's more questions, there's more things that we can look at. For example, one thing that I have not looked at yet is the effect of siblings. So a lot of our households, we have more than one kid that we have data from. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And so looking at that dynamic, looking at the parental behavior and how that's influencing. So this, again, just a tidbit. So with that, questions. And I'll remind you, if you're a student in the class, say your name so your question will get recorded. Over here.
Parents that the children are riding with make a significant difference in whether or not they were comfortable riding?
We did not ask that. It was just generic with my parents. Yeah, that would be interesting, though, to see if that would make a difference. But the question wasn't worded. I wouldn't be able to figure that out with these data. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to start with like the third row up. Yes, you with the dark shirt. Yes.
I was going to ask, you thought of or did you attempt to control or normalize for the amount of physical activity children are doing on a weekly basis?
I have not yet, but we have those data. So we could look at questions of if the kids are, playing a lot of soccer or something else, does that mean that they're maybe not biking or walking as much or things like that? We can definitely look at that. One thing I will note, and I think it's another reason why we're not necessarily seeing as many differences in behavior over time, for example, or sometimes even between genders. Even with 5 days of data, there's a lot of variation in people's behavior. So even with 5 days before and 5 days after, the differences just due to random things are perhaps larger than we expected when we designed this study. Yeah. Okay, so you were next.
I was curious about how many of your students participated in the Safe Routes to School programs?
Oh, I do not know that number right now. We did ask a question about, do you remember anything at school that was promoting walking and bicycling? So we do have those data. I haven't looked at it yet. I hope I'm not going to start sounding like a broken record with that answer. So this is what happens when you do a study with a huge amount of data and not enough time yet to look at it all. Okay, so the woman with the red shirt.
Is it possible that the response over too much time and the response over sweatiness are kind of related in that women may be adding in not just the time from location to location, but the time it takes to prep and then prep after for work? Because it seems to me that those might be related, and that would be true for kind of older girls as well.
Or they're writing more slowly.
Yeah.
They could be riding more slowly, for sure. And actually, we can look at that with our GPS data to see the difference in speeds. The other thing, again, this is anecdotal, but again, when I present this type of information and I hear from parents, in those tween years, girls are starting to spend more time in the morning getting ready for school. So they're spending more time doing other personal grooming, etc. And so time is a bigger constraint, perhaps, to them. So yeah, they definitely could be tied together. Yeah. Going down the road.
Is there any consideration given to the mode that the parent chooses on a regular basis? Like, are they full-time cyclists?
Yeah, so I don't have the slide handy. First of all, I haven't looked yet at the parents' behavior and how that might be influencing the kids' behavior. I'm sure it is. But a lot of these parents weren't biking either. I mean, we recruited a wide range. We wanted people who bike and don't bike, obviously, for this study. We wanted anyone who lives in those areas who is eligible. And so the rates of bicycling amongst the parents was actually even lower than it was for the kids. But I'm sure that there is a relationship. I just haven't done that analysis yet. Yeah. So let's see. Right, next down the row.
Spencer Topper. I wanted to know if the parents were aware of the study's purpose when they're being asked the survey questions.
Yeah. So we did not tell anyone that the purpose of the study was to see if bike boulevards had an influence over. It was, the title, Family Activity Study, they knew that title. They clearly, because we're giving them a GPS and accelerometer, clearly were interested in their movement and going places. But we framed it as we just want to know about your activity and your travel over time. Now, clearly, the survey asked a lot of questions about bicycling and walking, so clearly that's something. But we never said anything about the bike boulevard construction. And so, though I will say that the overall levels of biking in particular were higher in our treatment neighborhoods even before than our controls. And that's partly because the city, they just don't randomly choose streets to put bike boulevards on. They choose streets that maybe already have some features that make it a bit more bikeable. But, I mean, that's one reason we have treatments and controls, so you can see over time. Yeah. Yeah, Tara.
I was thinking about the
girls and how they're saying they don't know how to ride their bike well over time. And I think it fits with some of like what you look at like the sports literature about like just more self-confident, like conscious of their skills. But I was wondering if there's enough trips that you could look at girls travel over time and what kind of biking they're doing, because as they age, they might be transitioning from more sidewalk riding or that kind of to more in-traffic riding, which would fit certainly with the gender differences and like what kind of streets they're comfortable on.
Yes. Now we can, and this is some of the work that Joe Broach is doing for his dissertation. We'll be able to say whether or not they are riding on a street versus a path, and what type of street. The GPS isn't good enough to say sidewalk versus street, particularly sidewalk versus bike lane. And we didn't specifically ask questions about that, but we can definitely see if the types of streets versus bike paths are different over time and how that might change. And we can, the same thing for the adults, that we maybe wouldn't see as much difference. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just curious about differences, if there were any, between the children that used helmets and those that didn't, and whether kind of specifically it was any kind of predictor for future use of it.
We actually did not ask if the kids wore helmets. I think since it is the law that they wear helmets, and I think the observations, at least I'm pretty sure the counts that the city of Portland does, the helmet use amongst kids is really pretty high, and so that wasn't actually wearing the helmet wasn't something that we looked at. But what the question is getting at is sort of whether or not wearing a helmet might be a deterrent. And I don't think it really is that much of a deterrent. I think sometimes that, for both men and women and kids and boys, I think is a little overestimated in terms of the effect.
People keep taking the questions that I've had. But, the thing about helmets, I feel like for girls that are getting to 16, that could actually be quite a big deterrent. Is that, if they spend time doing their hair in the morning, they know that they legally have to wear a helmet, and so I know that that could be an issue. I was wondering if I was going to ask the same question about.
Yeah, I mean, there wasn't a difference between the boys and the girls with helmet being a barrier, at least what they're saying. And so, like I said, I know it often comes up. People think it's a barrier. I suspect that there's sort of bigger barriers before the helmet, not having a safe place to ride, things being too far. I think all those other things are sort of going to prevent both kids and parents, adults, from biking.
I've been doing the counts on Lido and on the waterfront pathway for a capstone project, and I've noticed that on the pathway, the helmet usage is a lot less, and even teenage girls even we're starting to take their off, because I was paying attention. I was like, wow, there's a lot less. And then her bikes rental stuff, they don't require it was always, you could tell that they required the kids and stuff too.
Okay.
So
yeah, and it could be if the kid's biking on their own after they leave the house, I guess they may be taking the helmet off too. So yeah.
Were all of the kids in this study, did they all own bikes?
Oh, yes. So as a criterion to be in the study was that you had to have a bike to be able to ride. So that was, all of these people had a bike that they could ride. Yeah, because that obviously can be a barrier.
Are you going to include if the schools they go to have enough bike racks for them?
Oh, we do know what school they go to. We did not ask the parents or the kids about bike racks at the school, but since we know what school they go to, we could find that out and see if that is an issue. Yeah.
Yeah, Justin Sherrill. I was interested in knowing what time of year the two GPS trackings took place in, and also what the span of 5 days covered. Did that include the weekend?
Yeah.
Or?
So the data collection took place either between July and October or April and August. And each family, like if they collected their data in 5 days in mid-July the first year, we got them 5 days in mid-July the second year. So it was rough. It was 2 years within a week or so. And then of the 5 days, at least one day was a weekend. Okay, so often it was like a Tuesday through Saturday or a Sunday through Thursday. So we got at least one weekend day. And then we also made sure that if they were in school in the pre-period, they were also in school in the post, or out of school and out of school. So we tried to have as much the same as possible. We do have data also on the amount of rain in those 5 days, so we can control for that when we compare the behavior over time. Yeah.
Kind of following up on Sean's question about the participation in sports, and I wasn't thinking about that so much in terms of an exercise budget, but about attitudes, about being sweaty, and about being physical would be one thing. And then thinking about the differences that we see, particularly gender differences in Europe versus the U.S. You know, in the U.S., I think kids start out at a young age thinking about cycling as play. And then play transitions here in, especially, physical kinds of activities, into sport or recreation. And I think in other countries, cycling is just presented as transportation. And so it could have a lot to do with how girls are receptive to sport and physical activity versus in other countries that doesn't even come into the picture. It's just the way you get around.
Yes. I think it's worth exploring. I think there may be something to that. I'm trying to think now. With the data we have on their actual behavior, so it's GPS data, we don't really know the trip purpose per se, but we do know if they go and come back without stopping, which is probably recreation in some way. Or we would know if they end up at a park, for example. But we also, on the survey, we have questions about biking to parks versus biking to school and things like that. We also have questions about their attitudes towards exercise broadly. So we can start examining some of that. Tara, did you? Yeah.
Presented in a Friday seminar on looking at the adolescent girls and their attitudes about exercise and then their attitudes about the biking. And there definitely seemed to be a correlation of more for girls and boys associating bicycling with a physical activity as non-trivial physical activity. So girls that were more positive about exercise and less self-conscious about being seen exercising were more likely to have good attitudes about bicycling. So you're right about this. The sport rather than a transportation tie.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I saw a hand up here. Okay.
Yeah, I was just thinking, have you looked at all at looking at students who are commuting to and from school and their perception versus people who weren't commuting to school to start to get at that?
I haven't yet. I haven't yet, but it's definitely something to look into. Surprising though, given how many of them didn't make any bike trips, but we do. We obviously have some kids who are biking to school, or walking to school. Yeah.
I was wondering if there was any data you had that looked at the correlation between biking and transit use.
Okay. So for all of these people in our study, we do know we can predict how much of their travel was on transit. And so if they were connecting, biking, and transit. Quite frankly, though, amongst this sample, we actually didn't have a whole lot of transit use. So probably not enough to answer that question. So for either the kids or the adults. We're surprised how low transit use, but families with kids probably are less of a market for transit, unfortunately.
I think you looked at other research in this, you were saying that the parents' attitudes were pretty close between boys and girls. And I think you've looked at this sort of girls being subject later to these stay-in-sight rules or not being able to range as far. I'm wondering how that sort of squares with you looking at different things, or if that fits in with that at all.
Yeah, so Joe Broach did, using actually the same data, some analysis a couple years ago where he looked at the sort of the rules question. So that was actually a separate question on here. So what I've just presented was sort of that general attitude of how comfortable they felt, which is slightly different than having a rule for a kid. And he was finding some gender differences in terms of parents having sort of rules for their kids going out, and that could be influencing. It's obviously very complex, and trying to measure all these, parent attitudes and their rules for their kids, and then they may have rules for their kids, but that they'll say on a survey, but do they always enforce them? And so trying to tease this out can be challenging. Yeah.
One thing I remember from Joe's work that was really interesting is there seem to be bigger gender differences in the rules for going to, say, parks versus going to school that way.
Yeah.
Where maybe there's this understanding that if a kid is expected at school, there's this understanding that they'll get there safely, and if they don't, you'll know. Whereas the park was this kind of unknown place, and then there seem to be bigger gender differences.
Yeah, and then also that's on the school trip, it's more likely that there's other kids and stuff going with them. And like the comfort question we asked alone versus with other kids, and in general, parents feel, more comfortable when there's other kids around. Yes.
Do you have any studies that have looked at college-age adults? I think that might be interesting if you looked at a campus that had a particularly high percentage of bike use, looking at gender differences there, and if there were any. And
yes.
I know where I went to school, most people rode their bike, but I know for a lot of campuses it's smaller and people walk, but I think there's a few that would be pretty prime.
So I haven't. I know Susan Handy at UC Davis has, and Gulsa, who was presented here a few weeks ago, did work on Ohio State. Do you want to add anything to that?
She did work at University of Maryland.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So they're definitely, and those are very different types of campuses, too. So, yeah. Any last questions? Well, there's no one to announce as the next week's speaker. I want to thank all of you. I'm hoping to, start sharing more of these data, having some more findings. Some of your questions were very useful to spur me to go do more analysis. Do our two instructors have anything else they want to tell people?
Which one of these fine professors are emailing your stuff to?
So those of you watching on the web, you got something due 5 o'clock Friday. Or Tuesday. 5 o'clock Friday would be today. Okay, thank you very much. Have a good weekend.